Welcome back to the Redemption Files. I'm your host, Abby Turner. Today's story is of burnout, reinvention, and love. After burning out in the city, Sloane Mercer retreats to her late grandmother's crumbling farmhouse, determined to rebuild her life with no attachments. But when a stubborn small-town farmer with a bruised heart challenges everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and belonging, Sloane must decide if she's finally ready to stop running and stay. Make sure you like and subscribe to never miss a story. Where the Wild Hearts Are. Chapter 1. The Leaving Kind. Sloane Mercer had always been good at leaving. She could pack a suitcase in under 7 minutes, book a last-minute flight while dodging subway commuters and existential dread, disappear so quietly from boardrooms and break rooms and brunch tables that sometimes she wondered if she'd been there at all. Leaving was easy. Staying was the trick. The morning she left Chicago, the sky was the exact color of wet concrete. It pressed down heavy and unyielding, like the whole city was daring her to make a break for it. She didn't flinch, didn't second guess. She just shoved the last of her life into the backseat of her battered car. 3 duffel bags, a box of books, and the dubious remains of her dignity, and pointed the hood toward nowhere. Willow Creek, to be precise. Population: who even cares anymore? Destination: one crumbling farmhouse and a half-forgotten promise she made to herself after her grandmother's funeral. "You'll come back one day, Sloane," her grandmother had said, voice already thin with the sickness eating her from the inside out. "You'll be ready when you're tired of fighting battles that don't matter." At the time, Sloane had smiled, kissed her on the forehead, and flown back to a life stacked high with deadlines and betrayal, dressed in designer suits. Now, barreling down endless stretches of empty highway, she wasn't smiling, not even close. The farmhouse came into view just after noon. It sat at the end of a long dirt road, stubborn and weathered, and tilting slightly to the left, like it had gotten tired halfway through standing. The paint, what little remained, peeled in long, curling strips. The porch sagged under its own weight. The field stretched out beyond it, wild and unchecked, swallowing up the fence line and any sense of control. Sloane pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. Silence swallowed her whole. No honking, no sirens, no buzzing notifications demanding her soul in 140 characters or less. Just the creak of the wind through brittle stalks of grass, and the low, disgruntled squawk of something feathered nearby that she fervently hoped wasn't a turkey. She sat there for a long moment, hands clenched on the steering wheel. This wasn't a strategic move. This wasn't a calculated step toward greatness. This was survival. Pure, ragged, stubborn survival. She hauled herself out of the car and onto the cracked gravel driveway, the air hitting her with a mix of wet earth, dying leaves, and something else. Something faintly sweet she couldn't name. Possibility, maybe. Or maybe that was just the exhaustion talking. The front steps groaned under her weight as she climbed them, the porch threatening to give up entirely on life. She jiggled the rusted key into the front door lock, muttering threats under her breath, until it gave way with a shuddering sigh. Inside, the house smelled of dust and old wood and time. The furniture was covered in white sheets, like sad, defeated ghosts. A grandfather clock in the hallway ticked stubbornly on, oblivious to the years that had passed. Sloane dropped her bags in the foyer and took a slow, 360-degree spin, hands on her hips. "Well," she said aloud, voice echoing off empty walls, "this is either the start of a bold new chapter or the opening scene of a very low-budget horror movie." The house, naturally, offered no opinion. The plan, if you could call it that, was simple. Stay long enough to fix the place up. Decide whether she was having a nervous breakdown or a brilliant epiphany. Avoid forming any emotional attachments to chickens, townspeople, or picturesque farmhands straight out of an unsolicited country music video. Leave when she got bored or broke, whichever came first. Simple, predictable, safe. She found the fuse box in the basement, cobwebs, 1 million functioning light bulbs, 0, and managed to restore enough power to make the kitchen buzz to reluctant life. The fridge, when opened, smelled like it had been fermenting disappointment since roughly 1997. She slammed it shut with a gag and made a note to buy cleaning supplies. And possibly holy water. Later, after she'd dusted off a battered armchair and forced down a dinner of stale crackers and lukewarm water, she sat in the middle of the living room, knees drawn to her chest, and stared at the cracked ceiling. What the hell was she doing? She could have stayed in Chicago, could have kept playing the game, climbing the ladder, chasing the promotions, selling pieces of her soul like stocks she didn't believe in. Instead, she was here, alone, broke, utterly, gloriously free. The thought terrified her so much she laughed, loud and startled in the empty house. And when the laughter faded, when the silence crept back in, thick and unrelenting, she whispered into the darkness, "Don't screw this up, Mercer." Outside, the wind kicked up, rattling the loose porch railings. Somewhere in the fields, something howled. Maybe a coyote, maybe just her better judgment. Finally giving up the ghost, Sloane leaned her head back against the armchair and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she'd start patching the roof. Tomorrow, she'd figure out where the grocery store was. Tomorrow, she'd pretend she had a plan. But tonight, she let herself be exactly what she was. Tired, scared, hopeful, and for once, standing still instead of running. The farmhouse groaned as it settled around her. A tired old beast still stubbornly breathing. And Sloane Mercer, reformed corporate queen, professional runner, accidental farmer, smiled into the dark. Because maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stay. This time, even if it killed her. Especially if it saved her. Chapter 2. Population. Complicated. Sloane's first official act as a resident of Willow Creek was to get profoundly, embarrassingly lost. Not just a little lost. Not the cute, "Goops, I took the wrong turn but found a charming bakery" kind of lost. No, the full existential crisis version, where the GPS quit halfway through giving directions, and the only landmark for miles was a dead possum and a mailbox shaped like a cow. She was trying to find Murphy's Hardware. According to the crumpled brochure someone had stuffed in the mailbox, Murphy's was the place for all your farming needs. Tractors, nails, chicken feed, existential support, probably a phone, which had bravely clung to one bar of service for most of yesterday, now displayed nothing but a blank, mocking, "No signal." Sloane thumped her forehead lightly against the steering wheel and muttered a prayer to the gods of rural navigation. This was fine. Totally fine. Sure, she'd survived corporate mergers, hostile HR takeovers, and Derek Cole's team-building retreats that mostly involved axe-throwing and thinly veiled threats. She could survive a little country inconvenience, right? 10 minutes later, she found it. Murphy's Hardware sat on the corner of Willow Creek's main drag, wedged between a diner called Maggie's and a suspiciously cheerful gift shop advertising locally sourced joy. The hardware store was everything she'd hoped for and feared. A ramshackle building with creaky wooden floors, a giant faded Coca-Cola sign above the entrance, and a cat sleeping on a stack of fertilizer bags just inside the door. Sloane pushed the door open, the bell overhead giving a mournful jangle. The cat cracked one eye open, judged her silently, and went back to sleep. Mood. A woman behind the counter looked up and gave Sloane a once-over that managed to be both welcoming and wary. She was in her 50s, wore a denim apron dusted with sawdust, and had the energy of someone who could build you a bookshelf and dismantle your soul with a single glance. "Ah, morning," she said, her accent rolling slow and easy. "New face." Sloane straightened, summoning her best fake-it-till-you-make-it smile. "Morning. I'm, Sloane Mercer. Just moved into the Mercer place out on Old Mill Road." The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly, but she didn't comment. Small towns, Sloane remembered, too late. Didn't need Google. They had gossip. The woman set down her clipboard and wiped her hands on a rag. "Name's Ellen. What can I get you?" Sloane pulled out her crumpled list. feeling absurdly like she was auditioning for survival. Nails, hammer, rope, maybe a shovel? And whatever you sell that keeps porches from collapsing. Ellen barked a laugh that was half amusement, half commiseration. Sounds like you're settling in just fine. Fine, Sloane muttered. As Ellen wandered off to gather supplies, Sloane roamed the narrow aisles. The store smelled of oil, wood, and something sharp and metallic. Tools hung from pegboards like ancient relics. Shelves sagged under the weight of bolts and screws in confusingly varied sizes. Sloane picked up a sledgehammer, hefted it thoughtfully, and decided she probably shouldn't trust herself with that much destructive power just yet. She was inspecting a frankly terrifying display of mousetraps when she heard the door creak open behind her. A few low, familiar voices rumbled at the front counter. Small towns, she realized, had the opposite acoustics of big cities. In Chicago, you could stand 3 feet from someone and be invisible. Here, you could sneeze 3 counties away and someone would offer you a tissue and ask about your family. She peeked around the corner just in time to catch a glimpse of a man talking to Ellen. Tall, broad shoulders under a battered grey t-shirt, ball cap shoved low over his messy dark hair. He laughed at something Ellen said, a low, rough sound that hit Sloane somewhere she wasn't prepared for and didn't appreciate. Nope, absolutely not. She was not here for complicated, broody farmhands with jawlines that could cut glass. She was here to fix her grandmother's house. And maybe, if she was feeling reckless, make friends with a chicken. Nothing else. Sloane ducked back behind the mousetrap display and pretended to be very interested in rodent control. Ellen reappeared a few minutes later with an armful of supplies and a knowing look. "That's Jack Remington," she said casually, loading items onto the counter. Sloane blinked, doing her best to project disinterest. "Cool." Ellen smirked. "He owns the farm next to yours." Sloane fumbled her wallet. Of course he did, because life had a sense of humour. And apparently so did the universe. She paid for her supplies, muttered awkward goodbyes, and bolted out of the store like it was on fire. Jack Remington was trouble, the kind that came with crooked smiles and calloused hands and a dangerous ability to make a girl think about staying when she should be focused on leaving. Sloane loaded her supplies into the trunk of her car and slammed it shut with a little more force than necessary. She didn't have time for flannel-clad distractions. She had a roof to patch, a floor to fix, a life to rebuild. She was the leaving kind, not the staying kind. And if she kept repeating that to herself, maybe she'd believe it. The drive back to the farmhouse was filled with the hum of tires on gravel and the heavy thud of her own heartbeat. The house came into view like a worn-out prize fighter, still standing after a few too many rounds. Sloane parked, hauled the hardware inside, and got to work. If she was going to survive here, she needed to focus. No daydreaming about charming farm boys. No misty-eyed gazing at fields of golden opportunity. Just nails, boards, survival. Simple, predictable, and safe. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked away the hours, stubborn and steady. And outside, under a wide and reckless sky, Willow Creek waited, not demanding, not rushing, just waiting to see if Sloane Mercer had what it took to stay. Chapter 3. Stranger on my land. The man in the dusty boots and sun-bleached jeans didn't blink. Sloane Mercer, still clutching her suitcase like a misplaced socialite, forced herself not to either. Rural standoffs, it seemed, were conducted in total silence under the judging gaze of a rusted mailbox. "You're trespassing," he repeated, voice low and rough, like it had been sanded down by a lifetime of early mornings and bad coffee. "Actually," Sloane said, lifting her chin, "I'm pretty sure I'm not." She yanked a folded piece of paper from her purse, shaking it slightly for dramatic effect. "Deed transfer. I own this place." The man's expression didn't shift. If anything, he looked bored. "Name, Sloane Mercer." Finally, a flicker of recognition. He pushed off the mailbox, wiping his hands on his jeans like he was trying to physically scrub the conversation away. "Jack Remington," he said. "I lease the land." Sloane blinked. "You lease it?" "That's what I said." There was a silence thick enough to butter toast. In Chicago, silence meant negotiation. Here, it seemed to mean something closer to, "Your move, city girl." "Well," Sloane said brightly, "that sounds like something we should probably talk about. Inside, before one of us turns into a Lifetime movie cautionary tale." Jack didn't laugh. He didn't even smirk. Instead, he gave the house a once-over, like he was making sure it wouldn't collapse before he could blame her for it. Then shrugged. "Your funeral." Inside, the house smelled like dust, stale coffee, and the faint, persistent ache of things long abandoned. The living room sagged in the middle like a tired old man. The floral wallpaper peeled in lazy curls from the corners. The last time Sloane had been here, she was 9, sticky with popsicle juice and blissfully unaware that life got uglier than playground spats and scraped knees. She planted her suitcase by the door and tried not to breathe too deeply. Jack stood just inside the threshold, arms crossed, a human barricade of disapproval. "So," she said, forcing cheerfulness into the room like oxygen, "you've been leasing the farmland." He nodded once. "Month to month. Worked it out with your grandmother before she passed. And now? And now you're here." There was no hostility in his voice, no welcome either. Just the factual, patient tone of a man watching a tornado form in slow motion. Sloane tucked her hair behind her ear, stalling. She hadn't expected it to be easy, exactly. But she also hadn't pictured facing off against a grizzled farmhand with arms like sin and a face that made her brain short-circuit at inconvenient intervals. "Well, Jack Remington," she said, clapping her hands together briskly. "Looks like we're roommates. Sort of." He arched an eyebrow. "You planning to farm?" Sloane smiled. "I was planning to survive. Farming might be a stretch." A muscle ticked in his jaw, the first real emotion she'd seen. "I don't have a problem with you staying," he said, after a long moment. "Long as you don't get in the way." "Wouldn't dream of it," she said, "but I'm going to need to see the lease paperwork." Jack's face did something complicated. Half amusement, half pity. "We shook on it," he said. Sloane blinked. "And that means what?" "And that's the paperwork," he said. She stared at him, trying to decide if he was messing with her. He wasn't. Of course. Handshakes, honor codes, the stuff corporate life had beaten out of her before she was old enough to rent a car. "Right," she said. "Handshakes, very frontier justice. I feel safer already." They stared at each other for another long, awkward beat before Jack tipped his imaginary hat and backed out the door. "Good luck, Mercer." The screen door creaked and slammed, leaving her alone with dust motes, peeling linoleum, and the kind of silence that pressed heavy against her ribs. Sloane let out a slow, shaky breath. "Well," she said to the empty house, "I've made worse decisions." Somewhere out back, a rooster crowed in what sounded suspiciously like laughter. Later, after unpacking exactly 3 shirts and 1 bottle of emergency wine, she wandered the perimeter of the house. Everything was smaller than she remembered. The porch swing hung drunkenly from one chain. The yard was mostly crabgrass and stubborn dandelions. The barn, listing slightly to the left, looked ready to collapse if she so much as sneezed too close to it. Perfect. No Wi-Fi, no Uber, no salad bars, just acres of sky, dirt under her fingernails, and a man next door who clearly thought she was one soft city breeze away from running back to her precious skyline. She'd show him. She'd show herself. Curled up on a creaky bed that night, Sloane stared at the cracked ceiling and fought off the gnawing bite of fear. Starting over wasn't supposed to feel like free-falling, but if her old life had taught her anything, it was that survival wasn't about brute strength. It was about stubbornness. She could be stubborn. She could be the most stubborn person Willow Creek had ever seen, and if Jack Remington didn't like it, well, he could build a bigger fence. Chapter 4. Terms and Conditions. The next morning started with a rooster shrieking directly beneath Sloane's window like he was auditioning for a horror movie. She jerked upright, tangled in ancient quilted sheets, heart hammering like she'd just been subpoenaed. Outside, Willow Creek was awake and unapologetic. Mist rolled across the fields. The air smelled like earth, dew, and possibilities. Sloane wasn't entirely sure she trusted. She stumbled into the kitchen, hunting for coffee, with the desperation of a woman lost at sea searching for land. The ancient Mr. Coffee machine on the counter regarded her with a malevolent hiss before producing something that vaguely resembled caffeine, if you squinted hard enough. Sloane took a sip, gagged, and muttered, "Poison. I'm drinking actual poison." The rooster crowed again, like he agreed. By mid-morning, she was ankle-deep in logistics. The property taxes were 3 years overdue. The roof was one thunderstorm away from becoming modern art. The barn needed structural reinforcements that, judging by the estimated contractor left years ago, cost approximately what she had in her checking account, $42.18. She sat on the crumbling porch step, head in her hands, when Jack's pickup rumbled into view, kicking up a dust cloud big enough to qualify as its own weather system. Jack swung down from the cab with casual ease, wearing worn jeans, a soft grey t-shirt, and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. He carried himself like the world had thrown worse at him than an angry city girl with a clipboard. "You look like you got hit by a freight train," he observed. Sloane lifted 2 fingers in a lazy salute. "Good morning to you too, neighbour." Jack climbed the porch steps, a suspicious paper bag in hand. "I figured you'd need this," he said, tossing it to her. Sloane caught it on reflex. Inside was a cup of coffee, real coffee, from a place called Maggie's Diner. It smelled like heaven and poor decisions. "Am I being bribed?" she asked. "Consider it a peace offering," Jack said. "We're stuck with each other, like it or not." Sloane studied him over the rim of the cup as she took a tentative sip and almost wept. Actual, functioning taste buds. A miracle. "All right," she said, setting the cup carefully beside her. "Let's set some ground rules." Jack raised a brow but didn't argue. "Rule 1. Boundaries. I don't want you walking into the house without knocking," Sloane said, crossing her arms. "Just because we're neighbours doesn't mean I'm baking pies and sharing life lessons over iced tea." Jack's mouth twitched. "Didn't figure you for the pie type anyway." "Correct," she said crisply. "Also, no backhanded helpful advice unless I specifically ask for it." Noted. Rule 2. Respect. I respect your lease. You respect my house, she said. You need something? Ask. Don't just assume I'll let you plant a second cornfield through my living room. Jack tilted his head thoughtfully. Wasn't planning on it. But I do need to move the south fence line a few feet. Cows keep wandering over. Sloane shrugged. Fine. Cows are negotiable. Living room cornfields are not. Rule 3. No pity. I'm not some fragile thing you have to save, she said, surprising even herself with the sharpness in her voice. Jack's easy smile faded a fraction. I didn't think you were. Something flickered in the air between them. Not attraction. Not yet, but something more dangerous. Understanding. Jack nodded once, serious now. All right, Mercer. Terms accepted. Sloane nodded back, feeling a little like she'd just signed a treaty after a long, messy war. They spent the afternoon patching a section of the front fence that had decided gravity was optional. Jack worked methodically, steady and silent. Sloane followed behind him, learning how to wield a hammer without sacrificing her dignity or a thumb. The sun beat down in lazy, humid waves. Sweat trickled down the back of her neck. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, bright and unforgiving. By the time they finished, Sloane's arms ached. Her palms were blistered, and her knees were stained with dirt. But the fence stood upright, more or less. Jack leaned on a post, surveying their work with a critical eye. Not bad for a city girl, he said. Sloane rolled her eyes. I'll put it on my resume. Can wield hammer with marginal success. Jack chuckled low under his breath, surprising her. The sound was rough, unpolished, and somehow warm enough to loosen something inside her she hadn't realized was wound tight. They sat on the porch afterward, passing a battered water jug back and forth like old soldiers. Sloane stared out over the fields. The horizon here didn't end in skyscrapers. It ended in more sky. "So," Jack said, breaking the companionable silence, "what's the real story?" Sloane raised an eyebrow. "You don't just walk away from a city life like that," he said. "Not unless something went real wrong." Sloane toyed with the rim of her cup, feeling the familiar pang of old wounds pressing against new skin. "Maybe I got tired of selling my soul in quarterly installments," she said lightly. Jack didn't push, didn't pry. He just nodded, like he understood anyway. Maybe he did. Maybe that's what scared her most. That night, Sloane collapsed into bed, bone-tired, but somehow lighter. There were still unpaid taxes, broken gutters, and a rooster she mentally nicknamed Lucifer. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't surviving by clawing her way up an endless corporate ladder. She was surviving by planting her feet in the dirt and daring the world to move her. Tomorrow, she thought, smiling into her pillow, they'd argue about whose fault it was that the water heater sounded like a dying animal. Tomorrow, she'd keep building something stubborn and imperfect here. One blister, one fence post, one brutally honest neighbor at a time. Chapter 5. Attack of the Chickens. Sloane Mercer had survived boardroom backstabbing, 3 surprise audits, and one particularly aggressive ex-boyfriend who thought sending edible arrangements counted as romance. She figured she could handle a couple of chickens. She figured wrong. It started innocently enough. She needed to check the side shed for tools. Nothing fancy, just a hammer and maybe a roll of duct tape, so she could continue her crusade against gravity, one loose gutter at a time. The shed, an ancient sun-bleached structure, held together by stubbornness and rust, sat behind the barn, half hidden by overgrown shrubs. The air smelled of old hay, wild flowers, and the vague promise of regret. She approached cautiously, sneakers crunching on gravel, one hand ready to fend off whatever small-town horror awaited her. What she did not expect was poultry-based warfare. The moment she opened the shed door, a feathered blur exploded outward. Sloane shrieked, an embarrassingly high, strangled sound that would haunt her dreams, as a chicken launched itself at her like a deranged heat-seeking missile. Another hand flapped wildly behind it, followed by a third, this one missing half its tail feathers and looking deeply offended at being disturbed. "Jesus Christ!" Sloane gasped, stumbling backward. The chickens, 3 of them, each more psychotic than the last, circled her with the slow, menacing precision of apex predators. Sloane brandished her empty coffee cup like a weapon. "Back! I have caffeine and poor decision-making skills." The chickens were unimpressed. One hulking mass of feathers and rage, she would later dubbed Cluck Norris, lunged again. Sloane dodged left, tripped over a rake, and landed flat on her back in the dirt, staring up at the endless blue sky and contemplating all her life choices. Somewhere in the distance, she swore she heard laughter. Jack Remington, traitor to humanity, was leaning against the barn door, arms crossed, mouth twitching dangerously. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His shoulders shook with silent laughter, while Sloane lay sprawled in the dirt, dignity in tatters, under siege by poultry. "You knew," she accused, pointing a shaking finger at him. Jack straightened, tipping his hat back to reveal a grin that could have powered a small city. "Welcome to farm life," he said, utterly unrepentant. Sloane sat up, dusting herself off and shooting daggers at the chickens, who had retreated just far enough to plot their next assault. "I was promised pastoral serenity," she said darkly. Jack snorted. "Pastoral serenity is mostly poop and property taxes." He offered her a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His grip was firm, calloused, real, the kind of touch that didn't apologize for being earned the hard way. Sloane let him pull her to her feet, ignoring the way her heart gave with a sickening. "Come on," Jack said. "I'll show you how to bribe them." He led her to a battered feed bin behind the barn. Inside was a bucket of cracked corn, essentially chicken currency. "You want their respect?" he said, scooping a handful. "You got to pay up." Sloane arched an eyebrow. "Sounds like bribery. Call it diplomacy." He tossed a handful onto the ground, and the chickens, the same demons who had tried to assassinate her 5 minutes ago, sprinted over like toddlers chasing a piñata. Sloane stared, unimpressed. "I survived a 6-hour merger negotiation with 3 hedge funds and a sociopath named Lenore," she muttered. "I refuse to be outmaneuvered by poultry." Jack chuckled. "Pride's gonna get you pecked, Mercer." She gave him a sideways look. "Story of my life." Over the next hour, Sloane learned the subtle art of chicken management. Bribery first. No sudden movements. Always respect the pecking order. Never, under any circumstances, turn your back on Cluck Norris. She also learned that Jack had a dry, wicked sense of humour once he warmed up, that he swore under his breath when the feed bag split, that he didn't rush, didn't hustle her, just worked alongside her like she belonged there. The realization was disconcerting. No one had made her feel like she belonged anywhere in a long, long time. By late afternoon, the sun dipped low, stretching the shadows long and golden across the field. Sloane sat on the porch steps, nursing her bruised pride and a mason jar of sweet tea Jack had conjured from somewhere. The chickens clocked contentedly in the yard, temporarily pacified. Jack settled beside her, stretching his long legs out and resting his forearms casually on his knees. They sat in easy silence, broken only by the buzz of cicadas and the distant rumble of a tractor from a neighbouring farm. "This place'll get under your skin, if you let it," Jack said, his voice low and rough. Sloane glanced at him out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't looking at her, just staring out over the fields like he was seeing something she couldn't yet. "Maybe that's the point," she said quietly. Jack smiled. A real one this time. Slow and warm. "Maybe," he said. Sloane sipped her tea and watched the sun bleed into the horizon. Maybe the chickens would kill her. Maybe the roof would cave in. Maybe she would fail spectacularly and have to crawl back to Chicago with nothing but a scarred ego and a chicken-related injury lawsuit. But maybe this was what starting over really looked like. Messy, chaotic, unforgiving, and a little bit beautiful. Chapter 6. Demolition Woman. Sloane woke the next morning to the sound of rain hammering the metal roof like an over-caffeinated jazz drummer. She lay still for a moment, listening to the rhythm of it, feeling strangely peaceful. And then the ceiling leaked directly onto her forehead. She bolted upright, flailing like a cat in a bath towel. "Brilliant," she muttered, wiping water from her face. "Just what I needed." Indoor weather. The leak tripped steadily onto the walked wood floor. A sad, persistent percussion. Sloane stared up at the sagging ceiling panel, half tempted to yell, "I surrender," and go back to sleep. Instead, she threw on her oldest jeans, a worn sweatshirt, and prepared for battle. If she was going to survive in Willow Creek, she needed to fix the house, or at least stop it from collapsing on her in her sleep. She started with the gutter, the one Jack had diplomatically described as a little rough, and she more accurately categorized as actively plotting her death. Armed with a rickety ladder she found in the barn and the world's least trustworthy hammer, Sloane dragged herself outside. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, but the sky still hung heavy and grey, like a ceiling about to give way. The ladder groaned under her weight in a way that made her profoundly question her life choices. Still, she climbed, gripping the sides like a contestant on a very bad reality show called City Girl vs. Gravity. At the top, the gutter sagged under a mass of wet leaves, twigs, and what appeared to be a bird's abandoned sock collection. Sloane grimaced and started scooping the muck out by hand, muttering darkly under her breath. "How's the view from up there?" Jack's voice called from somewhere behind her. She turned her head. A mistake, and immediately lost her balance. The ladder wobbled, shrieked, and pitched sideways. Sloane yelped, flinging her arms out. In a blur, strong hands caught her around the waist, hauling her off the ladder and back onto solid ground with all the grace of a forklift rescuing a very angry cat. They landed in a heap, Jack half sitting against the porch rail, Sloane sprawled across him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Sloane, whose pride had suffered enough indignities in the last 48 hours to last a lifetime, scowled. "You did that on purpose." Jack grinned up at her, maddeningly unbothered. "You're welcome." Sloane pushed off him and stood, brushing mud off her jeans with short, furious swipes. "I was fine," she muttered. "You were about to become a cautionary tale." She crossed her arms. "Maybe I like living dangerously." Jack chuckled, getting to his feet with the lazy, fluid ease of a man whose muscles worked better than the laws of physics strictly allowed. "You're stubborn," he said, almost admiringly. "Guilt." Jack looked up at the gutter, then back at her, his mouth twitching. "How do you feel about demolition?" Sloane, it turned out, felt surprisingly good about demolition. Jack handed her a crowbar, rusted, heavy, and imbued with generations of rural resentment, and pointed at the worst section of the porch roof. "Swing hard," he said. She didn't need to be told twice. The first blow sent a shower of rotten wood and debris raining down. The second cracked a support beam with a satisfying splintering noise. By the third, Sloane was grinning like a maniac. It was cathartic. Smashing things felt amazing. Each crack and crash shook loose a little more of the tight, stressed-out shell she'd worn for years. By the time they finished, she was breathless, filthy, and smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. Jack surveyed the wreckage approvingly. Not bad for a city girl. Sloane planted the crowbar in the dirt like a victorious gladiator. "I have hidden depths." Jack's smile was slow and genuine. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to see that." They sat on the porch steps again, or what was left of them, passing a thermos of halfway decent coffee between them. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and cool. "You really planning to stay?" Jack asked after a while, voice casual but not careless. Sloane stared out over the fields, where the grass shimmered in the wet light. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe." Jack nodded, like that was good enough. For now. Later, when the sun dipped low and the horizon glowed pink and gold, Sloane wandered the edges of the field alone. She kicked at a clump of mud with the toe of her boot, feeling the tug of exhaustion and something deeper, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The farmhouse wasn't a mansion. The farm wasn't a gold mine. Jack wasn't exactly Prince Charming, and yet there was something real here, something stubborn and imperfect, and worth fighting for. As the first stars blinked awake overhead, Sloane stood in the dirt, arms crossed, head tipped back. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't strategizing an exit. She was building something. Something messy. Something hers. She grinned into the wind and whispered to the wide, uncaring sky, "Bring it on." Chapter 7. Coffee and Consequences. By the next morning, Sloane discovered 2 important facts about small-town living. First, nothing stayed a secret. Second, Jack Remington made terrible coffee. She was halfway through her first tentative sip of whatever sludge Jack had brewed when he sauntered into the kitchen, looking far too smug for someone responsible for this liquid war crime. "You're welcome," he said, leaning casually against the counter. Sloane grimaced and set the mug down carefully, like it might explode if provoked. "Are you trying to poison me, or is this just a happy accident?" Jack grinned. "That's farm coffee. It's a hate crime against caffeine." He shrugged, entirely unrepentant. "Puts hair on your chest. I'll take my chances with anemia, thanks." They had developed an uneasy truce over the past few days. A tentative alliance built on sarcasm, mutual exhaustion, and the understanding that they were both too stubborn to back down. Every morning, Jack showed up with a chore list and bad coffee. Every afternoon, Sloane insulted his taste in tools and questioned his life choices. Every evening, they sat on the battered porch, watching the sun sink behind the fields, not speaking too much. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't flirting. It was something slow and solid, and cautiously growing roots. Sloane drained the rest of her cup with a heroic effort and stood, grabbing her work gloves. "Today's agenda?" she asked, flexing her fingers. Jack tapped a piece of notebook paper pinned to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a cow. Clean out the south shed. Clear the fence line. Don't die. Revolutionary. He handed her a second mug, this one containing coffee from Maggie's diner, blessedly drinkable, and tipped an invisible hat. Figured you deserved a reward. Sloane raised an eyebrow, but accepted it. What's the catch? Jack's mouth twitched. No catch. That's suspicious. He just smiled and walked out the door, whistling tunelessly. They spent the morning hacking back overgrown brambles along the southern fence line. Sloane quickly learned that country exercise was far more brutal than anything her overpriced Chicago gym could manufacture. By noon, she was sweaty, scratched, and seriously reconsidering her life choices. Jack, of course, looked mildly inconvenienced at worst, like a man whose natural habitat was mud, sweat, and stubborn work. You're flagging, he said, around lunchtime, tossing a battered canteen at her. Sloane caught it one-handed and scowled. I'm pacing myself, Jack chuckled. City folk always think they're smarter than the dirt. It's been winning a lot of battles lately, she muttered, eyeing her mud-splattered jeans. They took a break on a fallen log near the edge of the woods, sharing sandwiches Jack had packed, with a kind of grudging, companionable silence. Sloane tore into hers like a woman possessed. It tasted like cheap bread, slightly suspicious turkey, and absolute victory. So what's the plan? Jack asked between bites. Sloane blinked. The plan? For the house. The farm. Your grand plan to turn this place into a Bed Bath & Beyond. Sloane laughed, surprising herself with how light it felt. No plan yet, she admitted. Mostly trying to keep the house from collapsing on me in my sleep. Jack nodded thoughtfully, chewing. That's a start. After lunch, the conversation drifted. Jack told her about the Remington family farm, how his grandfather built it from nothing, how his father lost it in bad deals and worse pride. He spoke plainly, without self-pity, his hands moving as he talked, sketching invisible maps in the air. Sloane listened, something tight and brittle inside her slowly unwinding. No one in Chicago talked like this. No one sat under the sky and told you about their failures like they were just part of the weather. So what about you? Jack asked, tilting his head. What's the real reason you left the city? Sloane hesitated, fiddling with a loose thread on her jeans. She could lie, could spin a story about adventure and reinvention and new beginnings. Or she could tell the truth. I got tired, she said finally, voice soft. Tired of climbing. Tired of running. Tired of fighting battles that didn't matter to anyone but the people signing checks. Jack was quiet for a long beat. Then he nodded. Good reason. Simple. No judgment. Sloane felt something loosen in her chest. They finished the fence line by late afternoon, sweaty and exhausted, but victorious. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and gave her a crooked smile. Not bad, Mercer. Sloane grinned back. I'm adding rural gladiator to my resume. Jack laughed, a real, full-bodied laugh that made the air around them feel warmer. For a moment, standing there in the golden light, covered in dirt and scratches, Sloane felt something dangerously close to happy. That night, back at the farmhouse, she sat on the porch with a glass of too sweet lemonade and watched the stars come out. Jack had long since gone back to his side of the property, leaving only the comforting sounds of crickets and the occasional drunken rooster. Sloane leaned back against the porch rail, letting the cool night air wash over her. Maybe she was making a mess of things. Maybe she had no idea what she was doing. But maybe, just maybe, messy was better than hollow. She tipped her glass toward the sky in a silent toast. To consequences, she whispered. The stars blinked back at her, indifferent and eternal. And Sloane Mercer, demolition woman and accidental farmer, smiled into the dark. Chapter 8. Ghosts of the City. The call came just after dawn. Sloane was sitting cross-legged on the porch, cradling a chipped mug of lukewarm coffee, watching mist roll over the fields like lazy ghosts. She almost didn't hear the phone buzzing against the kitchen counter inside. Sharp, insistent, breaking the fragile peace of the morning. For a long second, she didn't move. Nobody she wanted to hear from called before sunrise. But old instincts die hard. She rose, set the mug down, and padded inside on bare feet. Unknown caller. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She should let it go to voicemail. Instead, she swiped and pressed the phone to her ear.
Hello?
There was a beat of silence, thick and too familiar. Then a voice. Smooth, self-satisfied, and unmistakable. Sloane. Derek Cole here. The name hit her like cold water. Derek Cole, Senior VP at her old firm, corporate shark, man who could make you feel like a queen at breakfast and a cautionary tale by dinner. Sloane studied herself against the countertop, breathing shallowly. "What do you want, Derek?" she asked, aiming for boredom but landing closer to weary disdain. He laughed, a low, polished sound that made her teeth itch. "Still straight to business. I always liked that about you. Listen, your name came up in a meeting yesterday. Some big moves happening, new expansions. We need someone sharp, someone hungry, someone like you." He spoke like he was offering her a throne. Sloane stared out the window at the stubborn green fields and the ramshackle barn tilting under the weight of another humid morning. Once, those words would have made her heart race. Now they barely registered. "We're talking director level," Derek continued. "Build your own team. Full autonomy. Remote options. You wouldn't even have to come back full-time. Remote. Flexible. 6 figures. Power." The old dream polished and dangled in front of her, glittering and hollow. Sloane's grip on the phone tightened. "Generous offer," she said carefully. "Generous and smart," Derek said smoothly. "You're too good to be rotting away out there, Mercer. Let's get you back where you belong." Where she belonged. Funny how 2 years ago, she would have killed to hear that. Now the words felt heavy, clumsy, wrong. "I'll think about it," she said, voice flat. Derek took it as victory. He launched into a cheerful monologue about timelines, onboarding packages, reclaiming your edge. She barely listened. When the call finally ended, Sloane stood in the kitchen for a long minute, phone limp in her hand, pulse pounding in her ears. Outside, the day pressed onward, the sun climbing, the fields waking up, the world uncaring. Inside, she was cracked open in a way she hadn't expected. The past had found her, and it still knew her name. The chores didn't help, scrubbing mud off the porch steps, patching holes in the back fence, mending a screen door that wheezed like a dying harmonica every time the wind kicked up. She kept moving because stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant unraveling. And she wasn't sure what would be left if she unraveled here, now, in the dirt and sunlight she was pretending to belong to. Jack found her around midday, crouched beside the fence line, wrestling a particularly stubborn nail into submission. He leaned against the nearest post, arms crossed casually, looking every inch the irritatingly observant neighbor she didn't ask for, but might desperately need. "Something's chewing on you," he said, not unkindly. Sloane didn't look up. "A job offer?" Jack nodded once, slow.
Big one?
"The biggest." Another silence stretched between them, but not the brittle kind. This one was heavy enough to hold things without breaking. "You thinking about it?" he asked eventually. Sloane drove the nail home with one vicious strike and sat back on her heels, squinting up at the sky. "I don't know," she said. "I used to think getting back in the game was everything. Now, I'm not sure it's a game I want to play anymore." Jack gave a small, almost invisible smile. "Sounds like you got more sense than most." He pushed off the post and wandered back toward the barn without saying another word, leaving her alone, leaving her to fight her own battle. And somehow that made it easier. That night, she sat on the porch again, laptop open on her knees, Derek's offer letter glowing against the darkness. She read every word carefully. The money was good, the title impressive. The future he painted for her, sharp suits, endless conference rooms, an empire built out of carefully negotiated compromises, was right there, waiting. All she had to do was say yes. All she had to do was forget how much lighter she felt here, how much steadier she stood when no one was watching to see if she stumbled. She closed the laptop. The offer could wait. The stars blinked awake one by one across the velvet sky. Sloane leaned back against the porch railing, feeling the night settle into her bones. Maybe tomorrow she'd decide. Maybe tomorrow she'd remember why she fought so hard to leave in the first place. Tonight, she belonged exactly where she was. Mud under her nails, wind in her hair, a heart stubborn enough to start over. And perhaps that would be enough for now. Chapter 9. Secrets in the Barn. Sloane had seen a lot of warning signs in her life. The flashing red kind, the passive-aggressive email kind, even the if you have to ask if this sushi is safe, it's not kind. But the kind she found waiting for her in the barn that evening, that was new. It started innocently enough. Jack had mentioned fixing a loose plank along the barn's back wall, and Sloane, still restless after ignoring Derek's email all day, volunteered to help. Jack had given her a wary look, like he half expected her to demand OSHA compliance forms, but said nothing. So there she was, prying boards free with a crowbar while Jack hammered new ones into place. The late afternoon light slanted through the cracked walls, turning the dust into suspended gold. It would have been beautiful, if not for the damn box. She found it shoved under a tarp in the corner, half buried beneath old feed sacks and a rusted-out wheelbarrow. The corner of a manila folder stuck out, accusing. Curious, because barn work wasn't exactly known for its paperwork. Sloane dragged it free. The box was old, dented, smelled faintly of mildew and bad decisions. She flipped the lid open without thinking, and the bottom dropped out of her stomach. Inside were papers, old bank statements, deeds, loan documents stamped with furious red letters. Default, foreclosure, past due, and stapled neatly on top, a thick, glossy file marked with the logo of her former company. Her heart lurched. She knew that logo. She knew those contracts. She had helped build them. Sloane sifted through the papers with numb fingers until she found it. Jack's father's signature and her firm's approval stamp. Sloane sank onto an overturned crate, the box heavy in her lap. The pieces clicked together, cruel and fast. Jack's family hadn't just lost the farm. They had been gutted, and she, Sloane Mercer, architect of aggressive asset recovery, had been part of the machine that destroyed them. The barn door creaked behind her. Sloane looked up to find Jack standing there, his hammer hanging loosely at his side. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, those steady, storm-grey eyes, saw everything. "Found it, huh?" he said, quiet. Sloane closed the box slowly, her hands trembling. "I didn't know," she said, her voice raw. Jack nodded once. "Didn't think you did." He crossed the floor with unhurried steps and sat across from her, keeping a careful distance. "I was 16 when it happened," Jack said, voice steady. "Watched the bank rep roll up in a brand new car, wearing a suit that cost more than my dad made in a year. Watched them carve up everything my family built because of a few missed payments and a lot of fine print." Sloane closed her eyes, guilt clawing up her throat. "I didn't write the contracts," she whispered. Jack's voice stayed low, firm. "No. But you helped build the system." Silence filled the barn. Not angry, not cruel, just heavy, true. Sloane opened her mouth to apologize, to say something, anything, but the words caught and died on her tongue, because what apology could erase that? "I came back here," Jack said after a long pause, staring out across the empty fields, "because I couldn't stand the thought of it ending that way. Thought maybe I could fix a few things, build something worth keeping." He turned to her then, really turned, and for the first time since they met, Sloane didn't see judgment. She saw hurt, hope, and something fragile she didn't dare name. "You're not them, Sloane," Jack said. "But you have to decide who you are." The words hit harder than any accusation ever could. Not them, but not innocent either. Somewhere in between, balancing on the sharp edge of old mistakes and new chances. Jack stood, dusted off his jeans, and offered her a hand. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was something more terrifying. A chance. Sloane took his hand, her fingers curling around his calloused grip. He pulled her to her feet without a word, steady and sure. They worked side by side until the last board was nailed down. The barn stitched together with stubbornness and something that felt dangerously like hope. Neither of them said much, but the silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was patient. That night, Sloane lay awake under the old farmhouse roof, the box tucked back where she found it. The ghosts of her old life still whispered to her. But for the first time, she didn't flinch. She listened, and she promised herself to run away from her past. If she stayed in Willow Creek, if she stayed with Jack, it wouldn't. It would be to build something better, something real. One nail, one board, one stubborn wild heart at a time. Chapter 10. Crossroads. Sloane hadn't slept. Not really. She had drifted in and out of shallow, restless dozing, haunted by the weight of old contracts and new choices. By morning, she felt like a ghost herself, hollow-eyed, brittle, and vibrating with restless energy she couldn't outrun. The sun crept up reluctantly, casting long, golden fingers across the worn floorboards of the farmhouse. Sloane sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop, Derek's offer letter open and glowing like a siren song in the dark. All she had to do was click accept. One little click. One little betrayal. Maybe no one would even notice if she slipped back into the city machine. Maybe Jack wouldn't care. Maybe she wouldn't either. But deep down, she already knew she was lying to herself. By mid-morning, she found herself wandering the property like a woman lost in her own skin. The grass was damp beneath her sneakers. The air smelled sharp and clean, full of earth and something sweeter she couldn't quite name. She ended up by the fence line, where Jack was repairing a loose section. He looked up as she approached, hammer pausing mid-swing. Something in his face shifted subtly, but she caught it. Recognition, worry, maybe even hope. Sloane hated that she had the power to disappoint him now. She hated even more that she cared. "Morning," Jack said, casual. "Morning," she echoed. For a moment, the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the rhythmic tap of Jack's hammer. Sloane shuffled awkwardly, hands buried in the pockets of her sweatshirt. Finally, she blurted out, "I got the job offer." Jack didn't look surprised. He just nodded once and kept working. "You gonna take it?" he asked, after a beat. Sloane twisted the hem of her sleeve. "I don't know." Jack drove a nail into the post with one clean hit. "You always know," he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even disappointment. It was just a statement of fact. And somehow, it gutted her worse than if he had yelled. "I thought I knew," she said, voice thin. Back there in the city, the goals were clear. Make partner, make money, make a name. Jack straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. And now, she looked out at the fields, endless and honest. "I'm tired of chasing things that leave me emptier every time I catch them." Jack rested his weight against the fence, studying her. "You don't have to explain yourself to me, but I want to," she said before she could stop herself. The words spilled out, messy and raw. "I spent years thinking if I just climbed high enough, worked hard enough, proved myself good enough, everything would click into place, that I'd finally feel like I mattered." She swallowed hard. "But I was just disappearing, piece by piece." Jack was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, voice low and rough, "You matter here." It hit her harder than any promotion ever had. Simple, steady, true, and somehow more terrifying than all the skyscrapers in Chicago. Because this wasn't about being impressive. This was about being seen. Jack pushed off the fence and started gathering his tools. Sloane hovered, restless, the words burning behind her teeth. "I'm scared," she admitted finally. Jack slung a coil of wire over his shoulder and met her gaze squarely. "Good," Sloane blinked. He shrugged one shoulder. "Means you're about to do something real." They finished fixing the fence in companionable silence. No big speeches, no melodrama, just the steady rhythm of two people choosing, in small, stubborn ways, to show up for each other. That night, Sloane sat on the porch again, laptop open on her knees. The cursor blinked at her, patient and pitiless. "Accept offer?" She hovered over it, thought about the sharp suits, the shiny titles, the endless climb, and then she thought about dirt under her nails, about the way Jack's laugh cracked open the air, like sunlight through storm clouds, about the stubborn, imperfect, achingly real life she was starting to build here. Sloane closed the laptop and set it aside. Without answering, without apologizing, without looking back. Inside the house, the floorboards creaked under her bare feet. Outside, the fields stretched into the dark, humming with crickets and secrets. Sloane curled up in the battered armchair by the window, heart pounding against her ribs. Maybe she was giving up everything she had worked for. Maybe she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But maybe she was finally choosing something worth fighting for. Not because it was impressive, not because it was expected, because it was hers. She drifted to sleep with the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, the scent of earth and rain in the air, and the quiet, dangerous thrill of freedom humming in her bones. Tomorrow would come with all its messy complications. Tomorrow she'd face the consequences. But tonight, misunderstand began a mental time and even more praised for human beings. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running. She was standing still, and it felt like flying. Chapter 11. Mending fences, literally and metaphorically. The next morning smelled like rain and second chances. Sloane woke early, blinking against the soft grey light filtering through the cracked window pane. The farmhouse groaned and popped around her old wood settling, pipes complaining, the low murmur of a place still alive in spite of itself. She stretched, her muscles protesting after yesterday's fence repairs, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. No alarms, no schedules, no board meetings waiting to get to her before the second cup of coffee, just the slow, stubborn rhythm of a life she was still figuring out how to live. And somewhere outside, a very smug rooster already crowing victory over the day. By 8, she was elbow deep in reality. The porch needed reinforcing. The barn door sagged so badly it was practically an invitation to the next windstorm. Half the tools were rusted relics that belonged in a museum, possibly under glass. Jack appeared as if summoned, carrying a bat and toolbox and 2 cups of blessedly drinkable coffee from Maggie's diner. He handed one to her without comment, like it was a ritual they'd always shared. Sloane sipped and sighed in gratitude. "Remind me to name my firstborn after you," she muttered. Jack chuckled low in his throat. "Hope you like the name Black Coffee, because that's all I'm responsible for." They started with the porch. Jack showed her how to brace the rotting beams, measure angles, and hammer without breaking every bone in her hand. At first, Sloane was all stubborn pride, refusing help, insisting she could manage. By the 3rd bent nail, she accepted that trial and error in farm repair usually meant trial by humility. Jack didn't gloat, didn't lecture. He just worked beside her, steady as the rising sun, handing her the hammer when she dropped it, and laughing under his breath when she cursed creatively. Around midday, they sat on the front steps, sharing sandwiches and stories. Sloane found herself talking about things she hadn't said out loud in years. About the night she closed her first big client deal, how she celebrated alone, with cheap champagne and the hollow applause of strangers. About the panic attacks she'd hidden behind pressed suits and rehearsed smiles. Jack listened, never interrupting, never asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. When she finished, he offered her half of his chocolate chip cookie, without a word. It felt a lot like forgiveness, or maybe just understanding. Either way, Sloane took it. The afternoon passed in the easy, companionable way she was learning to recognize. Conversation punctuated by long stretches of silence, where work filled the spaces words usually cluttered. They replaced the broken porch slats one by one, measured, cut, hammered. The rhythm was slow and honest, something permanent, built with hands and sweat and shared stubbornness. Something Sloane hadn't realized she needed until she had it. By sunset, the porch was whole again. Crooked in a few places, sure, a little rough around the edges, but standing, solid, just on my own, tells me how it will be left. A glad reference. Jack leaned against the porch rail, surveying their work with a faint, satisfied smile. "You'll make a decent farmhand yet, Mercer," he said. Sloane snorted. "Dream big, Remington." They clinked their coffee mugs together in a lazy toast. The sky burned gold and purple around them. And for the first time since she arrived, Sloane didn't feel like she was standing on borrowed ground. She felt rooted, still herself, but different too. Less brittle, more real. Later, after Jack wandered back to his side of the property, and the world settled into that soft, humming twilight, Sloane sat on the porch alone, feet propped on the new boards. She ran her fingers over the rough grain of the wood. Solid, impermanent, maybe. Nothing lasted forever, but real. And she had built it. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, just because it needed doing, just because she could. The stars blinked awake overhead, scattered across the velvet dark. Sloane leaned back, a slow, stubborn smile curling at the edges of her mouth. She wasn't fixed. She wasn't whole, but she was starting to mend. One splinter, one nail, and one honest, messy day at a time. Chapter 12. The problem with fireworks. Willow Creek took the 4th of July seriously. Like, suspiciously seriously. By noon, the town square was decked out in enough red, white, and blue bunting to qualify as a minor explosion hazard. Every porch sported a flag. Every truck bed carried coolers and lawn chairs like they were heading into battle. And every available surface featured hand-painted signs advertising pie-eating contests, sack races, and something ominously called the Greased Pig Scramble. Sloane took it all in with a mix of horror and awe, cradling a styrofoam cup of lemonade and wondering how she had been roped into this. Correction. She knew exactly how. Jack Remington. "You promised," Jack said, smirking down at her as they walked through the crowd. "I promised I'd come watch," Sloane clarified. "I did not promise to participate in whatever medieval nonsense this is." Jack laughed low and warm, and Sloane hated how much she liked the sound of it. "You'll love it," he said. "Pie, fireworks, minor property damage. It's the American dream. And here I thought the American dream was crushing student debt and existential dread." "That's plan B," Jack said, deadpan. Despite herself, Sloane relaxed. The sun was hot on her shoulders. The air smelled like grilled meat and fresh-cut grass. Kids shrieked and raced each other through the park, high on sugar and freedom. It wasn't perfect. It was a little chaotic, a little messy, and somehow it felt more real than any networking gala or rooftop cocktail hour she'd ever attended in Chicago. Jack steered her toward the edge of the park, where a small crowd was gathering around a rickety-looking wooden stage. "Pie-eating contest's about to start," he said, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Oh no," Sloane said, immediately suspicious. "Oh yes," Jack replied, grinning like the devil. Before she could escape, someone thrust a bib over her head and shoved a paper plate loaded with blueberry pie into her hands. Sloane stared down at the pie, then up at Jack, betrayal clear in every molecule of her being. "This is war," she said. Jack just winked and took a seat on the bleachers, clearly prepared to enjoy the carnage. 15 minutes later, Sloane was covered in blueberry filling, breathing heavily and seriously reconsidering her life choices. She had not won. She had, however, managed to beat 2 high school linebackers and one suspiciously competitive grandmother, which he considered a moral victory. Jack clapped as she stumbled off stage, laughing so hard he nearly dropped his lemonade. "You looked majestic," he said. "I hope you get a pie to the face," Sloane muttered, wiping purple goo from her nose. Jack offered her a towel, and something else she couldn't quite name. Pride? Admiration? Something warm that made her stomach twist in ways that had nothing to do with blueberry overload. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the town shifted gears. Blankets and folding chairs unfurled across the park. Coolers popped open. Glow sticks cracked and shimmered in the gathering dusk. Sloane found herself sitting beside Jack on the bed of his truck, legs swinging over the edge, a shared bag of kettle corn between them. The sky stretched wide and velvet above, the first stars just beginning to pierce through. "You ever miss it?" Jack asked, voice low. Sloane didn't have to ask what he meant. Chicago, the city, the Klein. She thought about it. Really thought. And then she shook her head. "Sometimes I miss who I thought I'd be," she said. Jack nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. The first firework cracked open the sky. A red bloom, followed by a low, rolling boom. Sloane tilted her head back, watching the colours smear across the stars. She hadn't realised how close Jack was sitting until his shoulder brushed hers. He didn't move away, neither did she. For a while, they sat in silence, trading quiet smiles and handfuls of kettle corn. The fireworks painting their faces in bursts of silver and gold. Then, between one glittering explosion and the next, Jack turned toward her, and everything shifted. It wasn't a grand, sweeping moment. There were no violins, no slow-motion cinematic cues, just the soft, inevitable pull of two people who had spent weeks skirting the edges of something bigger than either of them wanted to admit. Sloane met his eyes, steady, unflinching. Jack's hand found hers, fingers rough and warm against her skin. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Their lips met in a kiss that was awkward at first. A bump of noses, a startled laugh, and then, soft, sure, a little wild around the edges, just like everything else about them. When they broke apart, the sky was still exploding overhead. Jack rested his forehead against hers, grinning like he couldn't quite believe it either. "Took you long enough," Sloane whispered, breathless. "I was being a gentleman," he murmured. She huffed a laugh. "Don't strain yourself." They sat there until the last firework faded, the world settling back into darkness, and crickets, and the occasional distant pop of leftover sparklers. Sloane leaned into Jack's side, his arm coming up to wrap around her shoulders without a word. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And for once, real felt like more than enough. Maybe tomorrow she'd freak out. Maybe tomorrow the ghosts would whisper again. But tonight, she let herself belong. Here, now. Messes, stubborns, wild hearts. And finally, free. Chapter 13. Backsliding. Sloane woke up with a distinct, creeping feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. Not in the classic sense. No walk of shame, no regrettable tattoos, no viral video evidence of public humiliation. But still, something inside her chest buzzed with restless, terrified energy. She sat up slowly, the worn quilt sliding off her shoulders. The world outside the window was bright and loud. Birds shrieked. The rooster screamed his usual war cry. Life, irritatingly, insisted on continuing. Sloane buried her face in her hands and groaned. She had kissed Jack Remington. Worse. She had liked it. Worse still. She wanted to do it again. She spent the morning in a state of strategic avoidance, scrubbing the kitchen counters within an inch of their lives, reorganizing the pantry by height, and contemplating alphabetizing the spices, before deciding that would be a step too close to full-blown existential collapse. Jack didn't show up, which was fine. Totally fine. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he was giving her space. Maybe he was somewhere laughing about how the city girl had finally cracked. By noon, she was jumpy enough that when someone knocked on the front door of Flower, she yanked the door open, heart hammering, to find Mrs. Conway, the neighbour, holding a pie. "Welcome, committee's late this year," Mrs. Conway said cheerfully, shoving the pie into Sloane's hands. "You'll survive." Then she disappeared back down the front walk without waiting for thanks or conversation. Sloane stared after her, mystified. Small towns were weird. By 2:00, she couldn't take it anymore. She found herself marching across the field toward Jack's place, armed with the pie and a stubborn need for answers. Maybe it had been a mistake. Maybe it was one night, one kiss, one stupid moment of fireworks and misplaced emotion. Fine. But she needed to know. She wasn't the type to leave things hanging. At least, that's what she told herself as she stomped toward the barn like an invading army. Jack was inside, fiddling with the engine of an ancient tractor that coughed and wheezed like it was 2 steps from mechanical hospice. He looked up when she entered, his face going carefully neutral. Sloane hated that neutrality. It made her skin itch. "Brought you pie," she said, thrusting it at him like a weapon. Jack wiped his hands on a rag and accepted the offering with a bemused look. "Thanks." Silence. Heavy, awkward, unbearable. Sloane shifted from foot to foot. "So," she said, "about last night." Jack set the pie down carefully on a workbench. "Yeah," he said. Silence again. Sloane rolled her eyes skyward. "Okay, clearly one of us has to be the adult here." Jack quirked a brow. "That's new for you." Sloane narrowed her eyes. "I'm trying, Remington. Don't make me regret it." Jack tossed the rag aside and crossed his arms, watching her with that maddening, unreadable expression. "It was a kiss," he said finally. "No big deal." Sloane's stomach dropped. "Oh, okay. Cool. Definitely not a big deal that she'd spent all morning spiraling into a panic attack about it. Definitely fine. Right, she said, forcing a laugh. Just fireworks, 4th of July, nothing but cheap beer and bad decisions. Jack's jaw tightened, just a fraction, but he didn't argue. He didn't say anything, and somehow, that was worse. Sloane turned on her heel and marched out of the barn, boots kicking up dust. Halfway back to the house, she realized she was shaking, not from anger, not even from embarrassment, from hurt, real, deep, bone-aching hurt. And wasn't that just the cherry on top of her beautiful mess of a new life? She made it inside before the first tear slipped free, and she hated it, hated how much she cared, hated that she'd let herself believe that maybe she could have this. Him. A life that wasn't built on masks and survival. The rest of the day passed in a blur of stubborn silence. Sloane cleaned the chicken coop like she was preparing for war. She patched the screen door. She tried to scrub Jack's face from her mind, and failed spectacularly. By sunset, she sat on the porch steps, dirty, exhausted, and furious at herself for letting her heart get ahead of her brain. The stars blinked awake overhead. Sloane stared at them, arms wrapped tight around her knees. "Never trust fireworks," she muttered. "They always burned out eventually, and she wasn't about to get burned again. Except deep down, where she didn't want to look too closely. She already knew. Jack hadn't pulled away because he didn't care. He had pulled away because he cared too much. And maybe, so did she. Tomorrow, she'd figure it out. Tomorrow, she'd stop running in circles. Tonight, she just sat with the mess of it, the heartbreak, the hope, the terrifying, stubborn truth of it all. Chapter 14. The offer. The second offer came in the middle of a thunderstorm. Because of course it did. Because if life was going to corner Sloane Mercer with a decision that could break her heart all over again, it was going to do it under dramatic lighting. She found the email blinking on her laptop screen while rain battered the windows and the wind howled like a wolf in an old fairy tale. Subject line: Final opportunity. Leadership role offer. There it was. Big letters, big money, big future. Everything she had fought for, everything she had bled for, everything she thought she still wanted, until she stumbled into a stubborn patch of land and an even more stubborn man who made her question why she ever started running in the first place. The email outlined it neatly. Executive position, creative control, a corner office in a glass tower that overlooked a city full of people pretending they weren't lonely, and a clock ticking down. They wanted an answer. Right now. Sloane sat back in her chair, staring at the storm outside. The farmhouse creaked and shuddered under the force of the wind, the roof rattling like it might fly off into Kansas any second. It was, objectively speaking, a terrible place to live. Leaky windows, faulty plumbing, a homicidal rooster with a vendetta against humanity. And yet, Sloane couldn't imagine belonging anywhere else. Still, the old instincts gnawed at her. The need to win, to climb, to prove she was worth something. Jack hadn't said a word since the 4th of July. Not about the kiss. Not about her. Maybe he regretted it. Maybe he was fine letting her go. Maybe she was the only one spinning in circles, trying to read a map he wasn't even looking at. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes. Thunder rolled across the fields, long and low. Somewhere in the distance, the barn door banged against its frame. A hollow, lonely sound. She needed air. She grabbed her jacket and stumbled out into the storm, the rain hitting her like a wall. The fields stretched out in every direction, wild and fierce, and unconcerned with her tiny crisis. She loved that about this place. It didn't care who she had been. It only cared who she was willing to become. Sloane wandered toward the barn, soaked to the skin in minutes. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the world in jagged white flashes. The barn door swung open and shut on its hinges, creaking like something out of a horror movie. She ducked inside and pulled it closed behind her, heart hammering. The familiar smell of hay and damp wood wrapped around her like a rough blanket. And there, across the barn, standing in the half-light, was Jack. He looked up at her, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. For a second, neither of them spoke. The storm raged around them, loud and furious. Inside, the silence stretched taut between them. "You're soaked," Jack said finally. Sloane halved a short laugh. "Takes more than a little water to scare me." Jack leaned against a support beam, arms crossed. "You running from something?" he asked, voice low. Sloane shrugged out of her jacket, wringing it out with trembling hands. "Maybe," she admitted. "Maybe I'm running towards something. I haven't figured it out yet." Jack studied her for a long moment. Then, softly, "They called you back." It wasn't a question. Of course he knew. Of course he did. Sloane sank onto a bale of hay, exhausted down to her bones. "Executive role," she said, voice thin. "More money than I know what to do with. Power, prestige, the whole shiny package." Jack didn't flinch. He just nodded, slow and sure. And, she said, lifting her head, "I'm terrified that if I go back, I'll lose this." "This," Jack echoed, something fragile in his tone. Sloane gestured around the barn, the fields, the wild, stubborn sky. "You," she whispered. "All of it." The storm roared outside, hammering the barn like a living thing. Jack crossed the space between them in 3 strides. He stopped a breath away, close enough that she could feel the heat of him even through the wet chill. "You're not the only one scared, Mercer," he said, voice rough. "I'm just better at pretending." She laughed, a broken, shaky sound. "Typical. Always stubborn, always hiding." Jack cupped her face in his hands, rain-slick and calloused. "You want to run," he said, "but don't do it because you're scared you don't belong here." "Then why?" Jack's thumb brushed her cheekbone, a touch so tender it broke something loose inside her. "Because you deserve to choose for yourself." The tears came then, hot and helpless, not from sadness, from being truly seen and loved anyway. Sloane threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of rain and earth and something steady she hadn't known she was missing until now. Jack held her without hesitation. No promises, no conditions, just the simple, terrifying gift of presence. When the storm finally broke and the stars peeked through the torn clouds, they stood together in the doorway, watching the world rinse itself clean. Sloane felt like she could do the same. The email still sat unanswered on her laptop. It could wait. For the first time in years, she wasn't letting fear make her decisions. She was choosing. Messy, brave, wild-hearted, and home. Finally wasn't something she was chasing anymore. It was something she had built with her own 2 hands. Chapter 15. The Breaking Point. Sloane had always thought breaking points were dramatic. Someone screaming in a boardroom, a slammed door, a grasping, cinematic monologue. Turns out they were much quieter. Turns out they sounded a lot like rain on an old tin roof, and the tired creak of a porch swing, and a single wrong word hanging heavy between 2 people who didn't know how to fix what had cracked. It started the next afternoon. The storm had passed, leaving the world fresh and shining, but Sloane felt brittle, like a glass about to shatter from its own weight. Jack showed up around noon, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't shifted under their feet. He had a bucket of nails and a new section of fence to replace. Business as usual. Sloane, still raw from the night before, forced herself to go along with it. They worked side by side in silence. Hammer, nail, post, wire. Normal. Almost. Until Jack, in his typical infuriating, casually devastating way, said, "So, when are you leaving?" The hammer slipped from her hand and hit the ground with a dull thunk. She turned, slowly. "Oh." Jack wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his t-shirt, not meeting her eyes. "You're going to take the offer," he said, matter of fact, like it was already decided, like he'd already packed her bags in his mind. "You don't know that," she said, heart pounding. Jack gave a low, humorless chuckle. "I know how it works, Mercer. People like you. You don't stay in places like this. You're just passing through." The words hit harder than any argument they could have had. Sloane took a step back, feeling like she'd been slapped. "People like me?" she echoed, voice dangerously soft. Jack didn't flinch. "You're bigger than this town, bigger than this farm. You don't belong here." She laughed, then sharp and bitter. "And what you do? You're just going to stay here forever, patching fences and fixing tractors and pretending that's enough." Jack's face hardened. "Maybe it is enough. Maybe you're just too scared to want more," she snapped. The words hung between them, ugly and unforgivable. Jack dropped the hammer with a clang and turned away, bracing his hands on the fence post, like he could hold himself together by sheer force. "I'm not the one scared of choosing," he said quietly. Sloane swallowed hard, her throat burning. She hated him in that moment. Hated how he saw through her, how he refused to let her hide. She hated even more that he was right. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stalked back toward the house, fists clenched at her sides. Jack didn't call after her. He didn't follow. He just let her go. And somehow, that hurt most of all. Back in the kitchen, Sloane paced like a caged animal. Every instinct screamed at her to run, pack a bag, book a flight, disappear before she could be left behind. She had survived her whole life by leaving first. It was safer that way, cleaner, less painful. But standing there, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and the faint, stubborn smell of home, she realized something terrifying. Running wouldn't save her this time. Running would break her in ways she wouldn't know how to fix. Because for the first time in years, she didn't just want to win, she wanted to stay. She wanted to fight for something real and messy and completely outside her control. And it terrified her more than any boardroom ever had. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, a storm brewing inside her bones. Sloane pressed her forehead against the cool glass and closed her eyes. "I don't know how to stay," she whispered into the empty room. The words echoed back at her, soft and sad and true. Night fell heavy and thick. The farm slipped into darkness, and Sloane sat at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 100 different lives she could still choose. One path was bright and clear, and paved in titles and promotions and golden handcuffs. The other was rough and uncertain, and filled with broken fences and stubborn men, and a future she couldn't predict. The kind of future she would have to build on her own, and a heart she was still terrified to trust. By midnight, she hadn't decided anything and decide everything all at once. She closed her laptop, the offer letter still unanswered. She locked the door against the night, and she sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a quilt, staring up at the stars until her eyes blurred, and the ache in her chest dulled into something bearable. Maybe Jack was right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she wasn't made for this life. But damn it, she was going to fight for it anyway, even if it broke her first. Chapter 16. Things Fall Apart. The next few days blurred together in a slow, miserable fog. Jack stayed away. Sloane let him. Pride, fear, hurt. Pick your poison. She buried herself in work. As the suns came down, she was committed to the waves of sweat set the feet. She answered none of Derek's emails. She returned none of Jack's occasional, cautious texts. Always short, always logistical, never personal. It was easier this way, or at least it was supposed to be. The farm creaked and groaned around her, worn thin by the endless summer heat. The chickens gave her suspicious side-eye. The porch swing sagged under her when she sat on it at night, wrapped in her grandmother's old quilt, staring into the heavy darkness. Nothing felt right. Nothing felt finished. She had thought choosing to stay would be the hard part. Turns out, staying after everything fell apart was a whole different war. One night, after a day of hammering together a new feed shed, mostly out of spite, Sloane sat on the porch steps watching a stubborn sliver of moon crawl up the sky. Jack's truck rumbled down the road round 10 o'clock, headlights cutting slow arcs through the darkness. He didn't stop, didn't even glance toward the house. Sloane watched him go, heart aching in ways she couldn't put into words. Maybe she had broken them already. Maybe she'd been broken long before she even got here. The next morning, she snapped. Not in a dramatic, throwing plates, screaming at the sky way. No, it was worse. It was quiet, cold, final. She stood in the kitchen, sipping bad coffee, staring at the blinking cursor of Derek's latest email. Final deadline to accept offer. Today. Her chest felt like it was wrapped in barbed wire. She set the mug down carefully. She closed the laptop carefully. She went upstairs, pulled out the dusty suitcase she hadn't touched since she arrived, and started packing. Clothes, shoes, the few books she had scattered across the living room. She moved through the house mechanically, methodically. Like if she packed fast enough, she wouldn't have time to change her mind. She left the kitchen for last, standing there, staring at the battered cabinets and chipped countertops. She realized she didn't own much worth taking, just a handful of things that mattered. A cracked mug Jack had given her, a photo of her grandmother tucked into the corner of the mirror, a sweatshirt she stole from Jack after a long day fixing fences. Soft and worn and still faintly smelling like him. She hesitated, then stuffed them into the bag. Brutal, efficient, necessary. She loaded the suitcase into the back seat of her car, just as the sun burned away the last traces of morning fog. The fields shimmered under the rising heat, stubborn and golden, and full of secrets she hadn't stayed long enough to learn. Sloane gripped the steering wheel, heart hammering. "You don't have to leave," something inside whispered, but pride was louder, and fear louder still. She turned the key. The engine coughed to life, and for a long moment, she just sat there, the car rumbling beneath her. The road stretched out ahead, like a dare she couldn't refuse. Then, movement in the rear view. Jack, standing in the driveway, arms crossed, face unreadable. No words, no dramatic gestures. Just him. Steady, solid, infuriatingly calm. Waiting, not chasing, not stopping her. Just standing there, letting her choose. Letting her break her own heart, if that's what she really wanted. Sloane gripped the wheel tighter. This would be easier if he begged, if he shouted, if he made some grand, romantic plea. But Jack Remington didn't do grand. He did steady, he did real, and real was a hell of a lot harder to walk away from. Tears blurred her vision. She wiped them away angrily, furious at herself for making this harder than it needed to be. She could go. She could leave. She could step right back into the life that had chewed her up and spit her out, and called it success. The life where she never had to be vulnerable, never had to trust, never had to risk. Or she could stay and fight for a life that was messy and imperfect and terrifying. Stay and fight for a man who saw her, flaws and all, and didn't flinch. Stay and finally, stop running. The car idled under her hands. The field stretched out around her, wide and wild and waiting. Jack stood there, silent and stubborn, letting her make the choice without trying to save her from it. Maybe that was the most love anyone had ever offered her. The freedom to choose. Sloane closed her eyes, took a breath, and slowly, so slowly, turned off the ignition. The engine stuttered, coughed, and fell silent. She sat there for a heartbeat longer, hands trembling on her lap. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the heavy, humid air. Jack didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, waited, trusting. Sloane crossed the driveway toward him, suitcase forgotten on the back seat. She stopped a few feet away, wiping her palms on her jeans. "I'm scared," she said simply. Jack smiled, soft, fierce, proud. "So am I," he said. The space between them snapped tight, and then he reached for her, not with desperation, but with something better. Hope. Sloane stepped into his arms like she was stepping into sunlight, and for the first time, she didn't feel like she was falling. She felt like she was flying. Chapter 17. No signal. Sloane woke up to silence. Not city silence. The kind full of humming air conditioners and distant sirens. Real silence. The kind that stretched out across miles of empty fields, broken only by the occasional grumble of a tractor, or the slow chirp of crickets still drunk on the night air. She lay still for a minute, listening to the heartbeat of Willow Creek thudding softly through the walls of the farmhouse. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was running out of time. She felt still, present, alive, until she checked her phone. No signal, no bars, no Wi-Fi, no half-hearted attempt at a weak connection, just a blinking, mocking message at the top of her screen. Searching, Sloane frowned, holding the phone up like some ancient ritual might coax the gods of reception into noticing her plight. Nothing, no mail, no news, no frantic city energy bleeding through the pixels, just her and the farm, and an entire day stretching out in front of her, wild and unstructured and terrifying. She found Jack fixing the barn roof, shirtless and cursing creatively at a stubborn nail that refused to obey the laws of physics. So Sloane did her best to ignore the way her stomach swooped at the sight of him. Mostly a little okay, not at all. But she rallied, as was her custom, with sarcasm. You know, in some cultures, that much cussing is considered a marriage proposal. Jack glanced down at her, smirking. Lucky for you, I'm not that easy. Sloane grinned, feeling lighter than she had in days. She perched on the fence, dangling her feet. My phone's dead, she announced. Jack gave a non-committal grunt, hammering another nail into place. Power line's down. Storm took it out. Should be back by tomorrow. Sloane stared at him in horror. Tomorrow, she said, a little more pathetic than she intended. Jack chuckled. You'll survive. You don't know that. He gave her a sideways look. I do. The day unspooled in slow, stubborn loops, without emails or texts or frantic news cycles to chase. Sloane found herself doing strange things. She helped Jack mend the chicken coop. She repainted the back porch railing, carefully avoiding the splintered section she still planned to replace. She sat under the massive oak tree behind the house and read an actual paperback book, feeling faintly like she travelled back to 1993. And somewhere in the middle of all that, between hammer swings and paint splatters and the dusty smell of sun-warmed grass, something in her started to heal, something she hadn't even realised was broken. Around sunset, she found Jack sitting on the tailgate of his truck, nursing a battered guitar she didn't know he owned. He strummed a lazy, off-key tune, the kind of music that belonged to long summers and second chances. Sloane wandered over, arms crossed, pretending she wasn't curious. "I didn't know you played." Jack shrugged, not looking up. "Not well." She tilted her head, listening. It was rough, uneven, but it was real, like everything else about him. She sat beside him, close enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin. "You're better than you think," she said softly. Jack gave a small, crooked smile, fingers still moving over the strings. They didn't need to fill the silence with anything else. Not tonight. As the stars blinked awake overhead, Jack set the guitar aside and leaned back on his elbows, gazing up at the sky. Sloane mirrored him, the cool metal of the truck bed grounding her. Above them, the universe stretched out wide and endless. "You ever think about it?" she asked after a while. "About what?" "Just leaving everything behind. Starting fresh. Somewhere no one knows you. Somewhere you don't have to carry all the history." Jack was quiet for a long time. Then he said, voice low, "I thought about it. Every damn day after we lost the farm." Sloane turned her head, studying the hard lines of his profile. "What stopped you?" He shrugged one shoulder. "My grandfather always said, you can bury yourself anywhere. Might as well do it somewhere you love." Sloane smiled, bittersweet. "I think I'm tired of burying myself." Jack looked at her then. Really looked. The kind of look that peeled back all the armor and left her raw and blinking in the sunlight. "You're not buried, Mercer," he said. "You're just not done growing yet." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise. It was something better. Faith. Quiet, stubborn, maddening faith. The kind she didn't know she needed until he offered it to her without asking anything in return. They sat there until the air turned cool and the crickets outnumbered the fireflies, until the worries of the world, the emails, the deadlines, the endless proving, faded into nothing more than background noise. Just two people. One old truck, a broken-down farm, and a sky full of stars that didn't care about ambition or failure. Only the stubborn, beautiful fact of staying. When Sloane finally crawled into bed that night, the farmhouse humming around her, she didn't miss the blinking lights of her phone. She didn't miss the rush or the race. She didn't even miss the noise. For the first time in a long time, she didn't need the world to tell her she mattered. She knew it already. Knew it in the calluses forming on her hands, in the porch railing she painted, in the way Jack looked at her like she was something solid instead of something temporary. No signal, no noise. Just Sloane Mercer, messy and stubborn, strong and standing. Chapter 18. What We Build. The power came back the next morning. Sloane woke to the familiar buzz of the refrigerator kicking back to life, the faint whir of the old ceiling fan sputtering overhead. She didn't rush to check her phone, didn't bolt upright, heart pounding, desperate for news. Instead, she stretched lazily under the quilt and listened to the house settling around her, a living, breathing thing she was slowly learning how to love. Outside, the fields gleamed wet and golden in the early light, the rain having scrubbed everything clean. New beginnings smelled like damp earth and fresh coffee. She wandered downstairs to find Jack sitting on the porch swing, a mug in one hand and a lopsided grin tugging at his mouth. "You survived the apocalypse," he said when she stepped outside. Sloane squinted at him. "You're assuming I wasn't planning to launch a small coup if it lasted and are you adjusting a robe with a black cell beating on the peace of the white television darkness. "They stand in the shade," I said. "Far with fine," Sloane squinted. Jack chuckled, low and rough. "I believe it. You had the look of a woman about to declare herself queen of rural internet rage." Sloane settled into the swing beside him, stealing his coffee without asking. It tasted exactly like forgiveness and stubborn affection. The day passed in easy, golden stretches. They cleared out the old chicken coop, hauling broken boards and rusted wire into a giant burn pile out back. They scrubbed the barn walls, sweeping away years of dust and memories. They repaired the sagging fence along the southern pasture, laughing when Sloane managed to smack herself in the forehead with a road piece of wire. No serious injuries, just serious amounts of Jack trying and failing not to laugh. By late afternoon, they stood back and surveyed their work. The coop gleamed white and proud against the green fields. The barn smelled of fresh hay and soap. The fence stretched straight and stubborn across the ridge, like a challenge to the horizon. Sloane wiped her hands on her jeans and let out a slow, satisfied breath. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't shiny or new, but it was real. Built with sweat and calluses and a ridiculous number of bruises she didn't plan to document. And it was theirs. Jack leaned against the fence post beside her, arms crossed, surveying the scene with quiet pride. "Not bad, Mercer," he said. Sloane grinned, wide and unguarded. "We're basically superheroes." He nudged her shoulder lightly with his. "You can be Batman." "I'd rather be Wonder Woman," she said dryly. "Way better accessories." Jack laughed, and the sound wrapped around her like sunlight. They didn't talk about the future that day, didn't define anything, didn't carve it up into neat boxes and bullet points. They just lived, one nail, one board, one stubborn, messy hour at a time. It was enough, for now. That evening, they built a bonfire in the clearing behind the house. Old boards from the broken coop, splintered fence posts, piles of deadfall collected from the woods. The fire roared to life, crackling and spitting sparks into the heavy dusk. They sat in battered lawn chairs, sipping beers and tossing scraps of old life into the flames. Sloane burned the last of the corporate memos she found stuffed in a filing cabinet. Jack burned a mouldy ledger that once kept track of things that didn't matter anymore. They watched the past turn to ash and drift up into the wide, indifferent stars. After a long, comfortable silence, Jack spoke. "You ever think maybe it's not about building something perfect?" Sloane tilted her head toward him, curious. "Maybe it's about building something you can live with," he said, voice low. "Something you're proud of, even when it falls apart." Sloane thought about the house. Leaning, stubborn, beautiful. Thought about the fields untamed, endless, full of promise and failure both. Thought about herself bruised, messy, unfinished. And she smiled, because maybe he was right. Maybe perfection was a trap. Maybe the best things in life weren't perfect at all. They were just built strong enough to weather the storms. Later, when the fire burned low and the night pressed close around them, Jack stood and held out his hand. Sloane took it without hesitation. He pulled her to her feet and into his arms. The movement so easy, so natural, it made her chest ache. They didn't kiss. Not tonight. Tonight was about standing together, side by side, in the ashes of everything they'd lost. Tonight was about choosing to stay, choosing to build, choosing each other, without promises, without guarantees, without fear. Just faith, wild and stubborn and bright. Sloane closed her eyes and leaned into him, breathing in the scent of smoke and earth and second chances. Tomorrow would come, messy and loud and full of work. But tonight was theirs, built from broken boards, calloused hands, and a whole lot of hope. Chapter 19. Weather the storm. It started with a whisper, a low, restless wind tugging at the porch swing. A flicker of dark clouds piling up over the distant hills. The kind of shift in the air that made even the chickens skitter nervously into their coop hours before dusk. Sloane noticed it while she was scrubbing down the old kitchen cabinets, elbow deep in suds and a playlist of angry girl bands from the early 2010s. Jack noticed it too. By the time he knocked on the screen door, the sky had gone a sickly greenish grey that looked less like weather and more like an omen. "Storm's coming," he said simply. Sloane wiped her hands on a dish towel and tried to tamp down the sudden, irrational knot of anxiety in her gut. "How bad?" she asked. Jack shrugged, scanning the sky with the grim resignation of a man who had seen enough storms to know that pretending helped no one. "Bad enough." They moved fast. Jack showed her how to board up the windows, how to tie down the porch swing, how to secure the loose sections of roof that hadn't yet been replaced. Sloane followed his instructions without argument, partly because she didn't want to die in a Wizard of Oz situation, and partly because Jack in crisis mode was somehow even more infuriatingly attractive than Jack in normal mode. "Focus, Mercer," she scolded herself, yanking a stubborn nail into place. This was not the time for inappropriate swooning. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, shrieking against the sides of the house like a living thing. The trees bowed and shuddered. The fields disappeared under a wall of dark, seething clouds. Thunder rumbled low and mean across the horizon, and the first fat, angry drops of rain began to slap against the roof. Sloane double-checked the kitchen window one last time, heart hammering. Jack appeared at her elbow, steady and calm. "Are you ready?" Not even a little, but she nodded anyway. Yeah. They hunkered down in the living room, flashlights and bottled water within easy reach, the radio crackling occasional updates that mostly boiled down to, "Hope you reinforced your windows." The farmhouse groaned under the first real gust. Sloane flinched. Jack didn't. He just sat beside her on the floor, legs stretched out, arms draped casually over his knees like he had all the time in the world. After a long moment, he bumped her shoulder lightly with his. "You're doing fine," he said to her. She snorted. "If by fine you mean 2 seconds from crying into the canned goods, then sure." Jack chuckled low under his breath. "Storms are like bad days," he said. "Loud, ugly, but they don't last forever." Sloane wanted to believe him. Really, truly wanted to. The worst of it hit around twilight. The lights flickered once, twice, and then blinked out entirely, plunging the house into heavy, stuttering darkness. The wind screamed against the boarded windows. Rain battered the roof in sheets. Something, probably the barn door, or maybe her last shred of composure, crashed to the ground outside with a gut-wrenching thud. Sloane clamped her arms around her knees and squeezed her eyes shut. And then she felt it. Jack's hand, warm and solid, wrapping around hers. A lifeline, a promise, a stubborn refusal to let her weather this alone. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the storm raging outside, the farmhouse creaking and rattling, but holding strong. And when the worst of it passed, when the wind softened to a tired howl, and the rain settled into a steady drumbeat, Sloane opened her eyes and realized something even more terrifying than the storm. She trusted him, not just to hold her hand, not just to board up the windows. She trusted him with all the messy, broken pieces of herself she had tried to outrun for years. And somehow, he didn't flinch. Later, when the wind had died down to a whisper, and the stars began to peek cautiously through the broken clouds, Jack nudged her gently. "Come on," he said. "Let's see what we're working with." They ventured outside together, stepping into the wet, muddy aftermath. The barn door hung crooked, but still attached. The chicken coop was missing a few shingles, but otherwise intact. The fence had blown down along the south side again, but the farmhouse, stubborn, weathered, battered, still stood. Still home, still theirs. Sloane tilted her face up to the stars. Rain still dripping from the eaves, mud soaking into her boots. And for the first time, she didn't feel afraid of the broken things. She felt ready to rebuild, ready to stay, ready to choose. Jack watched her quietly, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "You okay?" he asked. Sloane smiled, tired and bruised and honest. "Yeah," she said. "For once, I really am. They spent the next hour hammering the barn door back into place by flashlight, laughing when Sloane almost dropped the hammer on her foot. They didn't talk about the storm. They didn't talk about the future. They just worked side by side, the way they always did. Messy, stubborn, real. And somehow, that was enough. More than enough. By the time they stumbled back into the house, filthy and exhausted, Sloane couldn't stop smiling. Because maybe life wasn't about avoiding storms. Maybe it was about learning who was worth rebuilding with afterward. And she had found hers. Against all odds. Against all logic. Right here and right now. Chapter 20. The Staying Kind. It took 3 days to fix everything the storm wrecked. 3 days of hauling lumber, replacing shingles, swearing at stubborn fence posts, and learning, again, that stubbornness was a renewable resource. The porch roof leaned a little more now. The barn door creaked every time the wind hit it wrong. The coop listed slightly to the left like a drunk sailor, but the farm still stood, still home, still theirs. And somehow, the imperfections made it better, made it real, made it theirs. Sloane stood on the porch on the third evening, wiping her hands on her jeans, surveying their work. Jack leaned against the rail beside her, arms crossed, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You did good, Mercer," he said. Sloane snorted. "I nailed my thumb to a 2x4 yesterday." Jack chuckled. Part of the charm. She rolled her eyes but couldn't fight the grin that pulled at her mouth. The sun dipped low over the fields, bathing everything in a soft golden haze. The world stretched out, wide and stubborn, and full of mistakes waiting to be made. It was perfect, in its own broken, beautiful way. "You staying?" Jack asked after a long moment. The question was simple. The weight behind it wasn't. Sloane turned toward him, heart thudding steady and sure. She thought about the city, the suits, the conference rooms, the endless race to nowhere, and she thought about here, about dirt under her nails, and chicken wire scratches on her shins, and a man who looked at her like she wasn't a project, or a trophy, or a stepping stone, just a person. Messy, flawed, enough. She didn't hesitate. "Yeah," she said, voice steady. "I'm staying." Jack's smile was slow and devastating. "Good." He reached for her hand, rough, calloused fingers threading through hers, and she let him, because this time, she wasn't clinging. She wasn't chasing. She was choosing. And for once, that choice wasn't about fear. It was about hope. They spent the evening on the porch swing, sharing a bottle of cheap wine Sloane found buried in the back of the pantry. Jack strummed the battered guitar, picking out slow, meandering melodies under the stars. Sloane leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the last sharp edges inside her finally start to smooth. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was theirs, and it was enough. Later, much later, Jack walked her inside, his hand warm at the small of her back. At the threshold, he hesitated. Sloane turned, brow raised. "You coming in, or what?" Jack's mouth twitched in a crooked smile. "You sure?" Sloane looped her arms around his neck, tugging him down until their foreheads touched. "Jack Remington," she said, deadpan. "If you make me spell it out, I swear to God." He cut her off with a kiss that was slow and deep, and full of everything they'd fought so damn hard to get to. Trust. Home. The staying kind of love. When they finally broke apart, Sloane grinned against his mouth. "Took you long enough," she murmured. Jack's voice rumbled against her skin, rough and fond. "You're worth the wait." They spent that night wrapped up in each other, the battered old farmhouse creaking in approval around them. Outside, the fields sighed under the wake of another hard-won day. Inside, two stubborn people figured out how to build something worth keeping, one bruised heart at a time. Sloane woke just before dawn, tangled in worn sheets and warm limbs, the world still hushed and half dreaming. She slid out of bed, pulling on Jack's discarded flannel shirt, and padded barefoot onto the porch. The sky was just starting to lighten, bleeding soft gold into the navy dark. The fields stretched out before her, wild and imperfect, and absolutely, fiercely alive. She wrapped her arms around herself and smiled. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't proving anything. She wasn't surviving. She was living, loud and messy and flawed and free, exactly the way she was always meant to. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Jack's arms slipped around her waist, pulling her back against him. They stood there, breathing in the dawn, letting the world turn without rushing it. "I'm glad you stayed," Jack said, voice rough with sleep. Sloane leaned back into him, smiling. "Me too." The rooster crowed somewhere in the distance, stubborn and unapologetic. Sloane laughed softly and turned in Jack's arms, pressing a kiss to his jaw. "Come on, farm boy," she teased. "We've got a lot more broken things to fix." Jack grinned, the sun catching in his eyes. "Wouldn't want it any other way." And they didn't. Because the best things, the real things, are never perfect. They're just built strong enough to weather the storms, built stubborn enough to stay standing, built wild enough to be beautiful. Epilogue. The long way home. The seasons rolled forward, slow and stubborn. Summer bled into autumn. The fields burned gold, then brown, then bare, under the first stubborn kiss of frost. The farmhouse groaned through the changes, as it always had, leaking a little here, creaking a little there, still standing, just like them. Sloane had thought that choosing to stay would be the hard part. She hadn't realized the real work came after. Mending broken gutters with Jack on Saturday mornings, chasing runaway chickens at dusk with a broom and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush, learning how to patch a cracked foundation, not just the one under the house, but the one inside her too. No shortcuts, no miracle cures, just time. And stubborn, ordinary love. They didn't have a grand plan. No 5-year projections, no color-coded charts, no neat, digestible goals. Just a house that leaned a little left, a barn that smelled like wet hay and good intentions, a couple of second-hand dreams stitched together into something better than perfect, something real. Jack built a new tool shed over the winter, using salvaged boards and a little more patience than he usually had for inanimate objects. Sloane repainted the kitchen cabinets in February, smearing green paint on the ceiling and laughing so hard Jack nearly dropped her when he tried to kiss it off her forehead. The rooster, who had somehow not died, despite Sloane's frequent threats, was rechristened Lucifer Jr. after an especially vicious attack on her ankles. Life was loud, messy, full. Some nights, they sat on the porch wrapped in a quilt, passing a battered thermos back and forth under the stars. No big conversations, no dramatic declarations, just the easy, breathing kind of silence you can only share with someone who knows all your broken places and loves you anyway. Jack would pluck lazy chords on the old guitar. On the evening, the laughed stage of Jack, Sloane would hum along, off-key and unapologetic. And the world, for a few precious, stolen hours, would be small enough to fit inside their hands. Not every day was easy. They fought sometimes. Real, shouting matches that left Sloane slamming cabinet doors and Jack stomping off to the barn until he cooled down. She missed the city some days. Missed the buzz, the anonymity, the ability to disappear into the noise when everything got too hard. Jack missed the life he almost had before everything fell apart. Missed it fiercely some nights when the crops didn't come in, or the roof sprang another leak he couldn't quite afford to fix. But the thing about building a life from scratch is you learn how to patch the cracks without tearing it all down. You learn how to stay, even when it's easier to run. Especially when it's easier to run. One night, about a year after the storm that nearly took everything, Jack found Sloane standing in the middle of the southern pasture, barefoot, mud up to her ankles, staring out at the battered fence line they had rebuilt 3 times already. He didn't say anything, just walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. The stars sprawled out above them, bright and indifferent. The farm breathed around them, stubborn and beautiful, and still standing, just like them. Sloane leaned back against him, eyes drifting shut. "I was thinking," she said softly. Jack grunted, dangerous. She smiled. "I was thinking maybe we could expand the pasture next spring." Jack stilled for a moment. Then, in a voice rough with something she didn't dare name, he said, "Yeah, I think we could do that." They stood there until the cold finally bit through the fabric of their jackets, and Jack grumbled about pneumonia, and Sloane teased him about being an old man. They walked back to the house hand in hand, muddy and exhausted, and entirely, fiercely alive. The rooster crowed at them as they climbed the porch steps, full of misplaced judgment and righteous indignation. Jack flipped it off without missing a beat. Sloane laughed until her sides hurt. Later, curled together under the quilt, Jack traced lazy patterns against the inside of her wrist, his breath warm against her neck. "You know," he said, voice slow and thick with sleep, "you're a pain in the ass sometimes." Sloane grinned into the darkness. "Right back at you, Remington." He squeezed her tighter. "Wouldn't change a damn thing." Neither would she. Not the storms, not the cracked foundation, not the stubborn rooster, or the leaking roof, or the 100 tiny heartbreaks it took to build something worth keeping. Because the truth was simple. She hadn't just built a life here, she had built a home. And, for the first time in a long, messy, beautiful life, she was the staying kind, too. Sloane realized that home wasn't four walls or a familiar skyline. It was a hand to hold, a life built from scratch, and a wild heart that finally stopped running. Thank you for joining me today for Where the Wild Hearts Are. I hope you enjoyed the story and Sloane's journey of love and self-discovery. Please like and subscribe for more Redemption Files stories. To support the channel, click the link in the description to find your next read in the Redemption Files online bookstore. Until next time, I'm Abby Turner. Take care.